Episode 11: How Families Can Lose Everything Slowly. Hello, I'm Alexander von der Phone, and this is the Next Gen Mentor podcast. This series is for you if you've grown up with family wealth always there in the background, sometimes helpful, sometimes confusing, and often not spoken about directly. And now that wealth is becoming something that you will soon have to relate to, and I am here to help you prepare to do that. Last time, we spoke about how decisions are really made, not as they appear on paper, but as they actually happen through influence, relationships, timing, and informal power, through conversations that often take place long before anything becomes visible. Now, we move one step further, because once you begin to understand how decisions are made, another question naturally follows. What happens when those decisions taken over time begin to move in the wrong direction? Not dramatically, mind you, not in a way that is immediately obvious, but slowly, almost imperceptibly. This is what we're going to look at today: how families lose everything slowly. It's not how most people think about it. The common perception is that decline comes from a single cataclysmic disaster, something visible, something you can point to and say, that's when it went wrong. But in reality, that's rarely how it works. By this time something dramatic happens, the process has usually been underway for years, sometimes decades. What you're seeing at that point is not the cause, it's the outcome. Decline is almost always a process, a series of small shifts, small decisions, and small adjustments, each one on its own entirely reasonable. But taken together over time, they begin to change direction, to drift, and often no one notices.
You mentioned drift before. Can you remind me what it means?
You may remember from our very first session that I mentioned it, the word drift, and it's important. Drift does not require intention. It does not require a single poor decision. It happens when attention fades, when understanding is partial, or when decisions are made without fully seeing their cumulative effect. And this is where most families become vulnerable, not at the point of complexity, but at the point where complexity is no longer fully understood. To understand this properly, we need to start somewhere unexpected, because decline does not begin with failure, it actually begins with success. Think back to what we discussed in episode 3. Family systems are rarely designed, they evolve. Most begin with a founder, someone decisive, focused, and clear, someone who builds something through judgment, risk, and consistency. In that early phase, everything is simple. One person decides, direction is clear, and accountability is obvious. And because of that, progress is fast. Over time, that success creates something else, complexity, and gradually, without anyone fully deciding it, the system shifts from simple and clear to complex and layered, from one decision maker to multiple points of influence, from instinct to process. And this is where the conditions for decline begin to form, because complexity creates distance, distance between decisions and consequences, distance between those involved and those responsible, and distance between understanding and action. And once that distance exists, responsibility becomes less defined.
Because it gets diluted?
Yes, you may remember from session 1 that one of the recurring patterns is reliance. Reliance on advisors, on structures, on individuals who appear to understand. And at first, this feels efficient. But over time, reliance can turn into dependency. And dependency creates a gap between being involved and actually understanding. Now, at first, nothing appears wrong. Decisions are still made, assets are still managed, and outcomes are still acceptable. And because everything appears to work, there is no immediate pressure to question it. But this is precisely why decline becomes dangerous, precisely because it does not feel like decline. It feels like continuity. This also connects directly to something we discussed in session 2. Pressure does not disappear with wealth. It just changes form, becomes internal. Expectation, interpretation, the need to align. And now imagine that operating over time across multiple people and generations. Each person is making decisions not purely based on clarity, but also on what feels acceptable. Individually, those decisions make sense, but collectively, they can create a gradual shift away from what was originally working. This is how decline shows up in practice, not through dramatic failures, but through patterns of behavior.
What are those patterns?
The first pattern is avoidance. Difficult questions are not asked, not because people are incapable, but because everything appears stable. Raising questions introduces friction, so things are left unexamined, not deliberately, but consistently. You'll recognize this from session 6 on building your own life, where we spoke about how easy it is to accept what's already there rather than question it. Over time, that behavior accumulates. The second pattern is overconfidence, a familiarity mistaken for understanding. People have seen decisions made, heard the language, and been present in discussions. Gradually, they assume they understand more than they do, and that gap only becomes visible when something changes. The third pattern is passivity, a sense that the system will somehow continue regardless, that involvement is optional, and that others will take care of things. And for a time, this is true until it is not, because systems require informed participation. Without it, something begins to weaken. The fourth pattern is misalignment between family members, between generations, and between expectation and reality. This rarely appears as conflict at the beginning. Instead, it builds gradually through different interpretation of what matters, what is fair, and what is appropriate. And because these differences are not addressed, they remain unresolved until they explode.
How significant are those patterns?
Individually, none of those patterns seem particularly significant. Each is understandable, but together over time, they combine to create drift. Drift left unchecked leads somewhere. You may remember from session 8 that risk is behavioral, not mathematical. The same applies here. Families rarely lose everything because of a single bad decision. They lose it because of repeated patterns of behavior, unexamined and unadjusted, compounding over time. What makes this more difficult is that the system often absorbs early mistakes. Losses may not be immediately felt. Poor decisions may be corrected quietly, and this creates an illusion that the system is more resilient than it actually is. But resilience is not infinite. Once the underlying behavior shifts far enough, the system becomes fragile, and something relatively small can trigger something far bigger. But again, that trigger is not the cause. It's simply where the accumulated effect becomes visible.
Are there any other layers I need to be aware of?
There is another layer to this, and it connects directly to how decisions are really made. If decisions are shaped by influence, relationships, and informal power, then decline follows the same path. It does not come through formal failure. It comes through informal shifts. Who influences who speaks, who stays silent, who challenges, and who does not. Over time, if the quality of those interactions declines, so does the quality of decisions. And this is where your role begins, not at the point of decline, but at the point where awareness can prevent it. What you're being exposed to now is not just how systems work, but how they can fail surreptitiously. And at this stage, your role is not yet to fix anything. It's just to notice, to recognize patterns early, to understand that stability today does not guarantee stability tomorrow, and to keep returning to something simple. Are we still operating with clarity, or are we relying on continuity? That difference over time is what determines whether a family preserves what it has built or gradually loses it. And there's one final point to understand. Decline is not only structural, it's also personal. It begins in how individuals relate to the system that they are part of, not in what they say openly, but in how they think, how they engage, and how they decide. And because these are internal shifts, they're rarely noticed at the time. You may remember session 5, where we agreed that respect is not inherited. It is built through behavior over time. The same applies in reverse. Loss of credibility does not happen in a single moment. It erodes through small lapses in preparation, through inconsistency, through decisions taken without sufficient depth. At first, the system can compensate, it adjusts, and because of that, there is no immediate feedback, which creates a dangerous illusion that performance does not really matter, except that it does. The feedback is simply delayed, and when it arrives, it's rarely direct. It shows up in how people engage with you. Less input requested, less responsibility offered, and less influence granted. This is one of the more subtle ways that decline can take hold, not through loss of assets, but through loss of capability. And capability, once lost, is very, very difficult to rebuild.
Are there any other patterns I need to watch out for?
There is one more behavioral pattern that tends to emerge at this stage, and that is comfort. Not comfort in the sense of ease, but in the sense of familiarity. The system becomes known, predictable, and understandable. And once that familiarity sets in, something else often follows. A reduction in curiosity. You stop asking certain questions, not because they're not important, but because everything appears to be functioning. You may recall from session 3 that systems become opaque over time. What was once simple and visible becomes layered and less clear. And without active curiosity, that opacity increases. People operate within the system, but are no longer fully understanding it. And this is where drift accelerates, because decisions are now being made based on partial understanding, not complete clarity. And that is dangerous.
Is this where advisors become more influential?
Yes, and this is where the dynamic becomes more complex. Advisors play an important role. They bring expertise, perspective, and continuity, but they are not a substitute for understanding. When families lose clarity, advisors often fill the space and begin to shape decisions more directly. They carry context that others do not. They become reference points, and gradually influence shifts. Now, this is not necessarily wrong. In fact, in many cases, it is necessary, but it changes the balance. Remember session 9, where we discussed that influence does not always sit where formal authority suggests. Over time, informal power can become a lot more significant than formal roles. And if that power is not balanced by informed participation from the family, decisions will begin to move away from the center of gravity. There's also a generational element to this. each generation inherits not just assets, but a system. And that system reflects the behavior of those who came before. Remember session 1, where we said that inheritance is structural, psychological, and relational. It's not just financial. Now consider what happens when each generation engages slightly less than the one before. Over time, these small differences accumulate, and the system begins to lose depth, not visibly but functionally. This is often misunderstood. People assume that decline comes from poor decisions, but more often it comes from a reduction in decision quality. And that reduction is usually behavioral: less preparation, less challenge, less clarity, less ownership. Each one is small, but together they change outcomes. There is a moment, and it's difficult to identify precisely when it occurs, when the system begins to operate on momentum rather than dynamic intention. Decisions are made because they have always been made that way. Structures remain in place because they already exist, and roles are maintained because they were defined previously, not because they're actively understood or chosen. But this is where continuity becomes a substitute for clarity, and continuity without clarity is fragile at best. You may recognize a parallel here with episode 6, where we discussed building your own life without simply following what's already there. At an individual level, this leads to a lack of independence. At a system level, it leads to stagnation, and stagnation over time creates vulnerability. Because the external environment does not stand still. Markets change, regulation changes, opportunities shift, and risks evolve. A system that is not actively engaged cannot adapt effectively, and when adaptation slows, decline begins.
What about conflict? Does that play a role?
Yes, it does, but not in the way that most people expect. Conflict does not usually cause decline. Avoidance of conflict does. When difficult issues are not addressed, they don't disappear, they remain. They influence behavior and they shape decisions indirectly. Over time, this creates tension. Remember from session 3 that systems carry history: past decisions, past disagreements, past outcomes. If these aren't resolved, like trauma, they continue to influence the present. And that influence is rarely visible, but it's always present. There's also the question of identity. At an individual level, we discussed in earlier episodes the importance of defining who you are within the system. If that doesn't happen, something else occurs. You become defined by the system. At a family level, the same principle applies. If the system is not actively shaped by the family, it becomes defined by its past. And a system defined only by its past struggles to adapt to the future. Another pattern that often appears is fragmentation. As families grow, perspectives diverge, priorities differ, levels of involvement vary. And without clear alignment, the system begins to fragment, not formally, but behaviourally. Different individuals move in slightly different directions. Decisions become less coordinated, and over time, the coherence of the system weakens. And this is where governance, which we explored in session 10, becomes important, not as a rigid structure, but as a way of maintaining alignment, of ensuring that decisions remain connected, of providing clarity when complexity increases. Without it, systems rely on informal understanding, and informal understanding over time becomes by its very nature inconsistent. You'll also notice something else at this stage: a shift in time horizon. Earlier generations tend to think long term. They build and they invest. They take decisions with a view far beyond their own involvement. But as systems become more complex and less understood, that time horizon can shorten. Decisions become more immediate, more reactive, and less anchored in long term intent. It's rarely planned, but it is visible in outcomes, and again, over time, it has a compounding effect. Let me bring this back to something more practical. Imagine a series of decisions, each one slightly less considered than the one before, each one slightly more influenced by convenience, each one slightly less aligned with long-term intent. Now, individually, they may not appear problematic, but over time, they change direction. And once direction changes, outcomes follow. Imagine it's a bit like a supertanker that drifts off course by just 1 degree every day. At the end of 90 days, is going at right angles to where you want it to go. This is why decline is so difficult to detect early, because there's no single point at which it begins, no clear moment of failure, just a gradual shift from clarity to assumption, from engagement to reliance, from intention to momentum. And this is where your role becomes even more defined, not in preventing every mistake, but in maintaining a certain standard of engagement, a certain level of awareness, a certain willingness to question, and a certain commitment to understanding. They're not dramatic actions, but they are definitely stabilizing ones. In session 9, we found that good decision making is not about eliminating human behavior, but managing it.
Can everyone see that decline when it happens? Or could I be the only one?
Decline doesn't affect everyone equally. Some individuals see it earlier, others later, some not at all. Some will respond, others will not, and this creates another layer of complexity. Systems are collective. They depend on multiple people engaging effectively, not just one. This is why awareness matters, not as a theoretical concept, but as a practical one. To notice when discussions become less rigorous, to recognize when decisions are being taken without full clarity, to observe when reliance is increasing, to see when alignment is weakening. Now, these are early signals, subtle but meaningful. And if you're able to see them early, something can change. You can begin to engage differently. You can ask better questions. You can seek clarity where it's missing, and you can resist the tendency to assume. And over time, that behavior has a cumulative effect. And this in turn brings us to an important realization that families rarely lose everything because they lack resources. They lose it because they lose the ability to manage those resources effectively. And that loss is behavioral, not financial, not structural, behavioral. So when we talk about decline, we're not really talking about money. We're talking about how people think, how they decide, how they engage with what they're responsible for, and how those behaviors change over time. If you hold on to that, you will begin to see something that most people miss, that preserving wealth is not primarily a technical exercise. It's a behavioral one. And behavior, unlike structures, cannot be outsourced. It has to be developed, maintained, reinforced. Which brings us to the next layer of this conversation. Because once you understand how decline happens, the next question, again, becomes unavoidable. Let's see if you can guess what it is.
What, if anything, can actually stop it?
Exactly right. And what stops it is not increased control and not complexity. If anything, both can accelerate decline when they're misunderstood. What tends to make the difference is something a lot less visible. A return to clarity, not once, but repeatedly. Clarity about what exists, about why it exists, and about who is actually responsible for what. Now, this may sound obvious, but in complex family systems, it's surprisingly rare. because over time structures remain in place long after their original purpose has faded from view. Decisions continue to follow patterns that are no longer questioned, and roles are assumed rather than consciously defined. Reintroducing clarity doesn't mean redesigning everything. It means understanding it properly, often for the first time in years. This is a moment I've seen in a number of families. Doesn't happen often, but when it does, it's noticeable. Someone, usually not the most senior person, simply asks a very basic question. Why are we doing it in this way? Not as a challenge, not as a criticism, but as a genuine attempt to understand. And what follows is often revealing because the answer is not always clear. Not because there's no reason, but because the reason has not been revisited for a long time. And in that moment, something shifts. The system pauses, enough to create space to think, space to re-examine, and space to reconnect decisions with their underlying purpose. You may remember from episode 3 that awareness is the first step to understanding the system. What we're describing here is a continuation of that process, not just seeing the system, but questioning it carefully, and doing so in a way that does not destabilize it. The objective is not disruption here, it's alignment. There is also something else that becomes important at this stage: ownership. Not ownership in the legal sense, but in the behavioral sense. That is, a willingness to take responsibility for understanding what you're part of and to engage with it deliberately. You may recall from our very first session that one of the early risks is becoming passive within the system. And this is the opposite of that. It's not about taking control. It's about taking responsibility.
So, surely, if things don't change, they cannot decline either, right?
Stability is not the absence of change. It's the ability to adapt without losing direction. And adaptation requires engagement. This is where everything we've discussed so far begins to connect. The system you're part of, the identity you're forming, the credibility you're building, and the way decisions are made. All of these influence whether the system remains aligned or gradually moves off course. And that alignment is not maintained automatically. It's maintained through behavior. So if there's one thing I hope you take from this session, it's this: families rarely lose everything in a moment. They lose it gradually, through small shifts in behavior, through decisions that feel reasonable at the time, and through a slow move away from clarity and into assumption. What it protects against that is not brilliance, it's not complexity, it's attention. At your stage, you're not expected to fix everything, but you are in a position to pay attention. And that's where prevention begins. So here are a few practical takeaways to carry with you. Things to do. Stay curious, particularly when things appear to be working. Ask simple questions when something is unclear. Take time to understand the purpose behind structures and decisions. Prepare before engaging, even in small ways. Notice patterns, not just individual decisions. Reflect on outcomes, not just intentions. Things to avoid: assuming continuity means stability, relying entirely on others without building your own understanding, accepting decisions without seeing the reasoning behind them, avoiding difficult questions because things feel comfortable, and confusing familiarity with real understanding. Next time, we'll move on to how to work with advisors without losing control, and we'll look at what they actually do versus what people assume, gain an understanding of their incentives and limitations, and how to stay engaged without becoming reactive or, worse, dependent. Until then, I am Alexander von der Fellen.